From the Alvin and Rosalie Sarachek studio, PBS Kansas presents Kansas Week.
One veto down, how many still to go? As Kansas lawmakers pass a slew of bills the governor's expected to nix. Lawmakers wrapping up the 2023 session with a flurry of last-minute legislation, from transgender restrictions to school policies unpopular with educators and maybe a budget. That's what we're talking about right now on Kansas Week. This is Kansas Week, and I'm your host, Pilar Pedraza. This last week was a busy one at the State House as lawmakers tried to cross the finish line to the first adjournment of the 2023 session. But it took them a bit to hammer out the details of a couple of bills, though they did manage to get a budget done. This is where lawmakers stood at the time of recording the show. They passed a budget, their primary job for the session, and spending the last of the federal stimulus monies. $220 million for infrastructure, $142 million for a health science center in Wichita, linking various medical training programs at Wichita State and KU Med here in the city, and $100 million for a state savings account. Lawmakers also passed a new flat 5.15% tax rate on all Kansans after the basic deductions. Attached to that was an immediate end to grocery sales taxes on January 1st, 2024. The Department of Revenue says these changes will cost the state some $330 million annually. In the middle of the night, lawmakers also passed a bill that will revoke the licenses of physicians who provide gender-affirming care to transgender patients. Despite multiple efforts, though, they failed to pass a school funding bill which included a freeze in base state aid per pupil and which opponents said would jeopardize the current Gannon settlement. They also were unable to get a bill with educational savings accounts, or vouchers, depending on your party, across the finish line. Phew, a lot there to wrap our minds around and a lot to talk about today. Here to help us do that, we have Brandon Johnson, a Wichita Democrat, and Dr. Neil Allen. He is a political scientist from Wichita State University. And joining us from the State House, we have State Representative Paul Wagner, a Hutchinson Republican. Paul, thank you so much. You had a very late night, and I'm going to start there. You guys did not finish on the House floor until 4:30 this morning. Lots of folks talking today about how dangerous that is. I mean, we've lost a lawmaker on one case because of that. And then, of course, there's a question about all the laws that get passed in the middle of the night when nobody's able to be watching.
Well, Pilar, I mean, I don't think the vote would have changed at all, whether it was 4 in the morning or 4 in the afternoon. But when you're up against a deadline, you got to do what you got to do. And we do have the 12 o'clock rule. I didn't think it was that far out of bounds. If you remember, back during COVID, we did a literal 24-hour day for sine die to get things done. And so it's odd, but it's Topeka. So, you know.
It is Topeka, and you're right. This is something that happens pretty much every year to some extent or another. I remember one year, I think it was a 40-hour day, the way they work their days. As you look at this, Neil, not unusual, but we definitely tend to see controversial bills coming through the legislature on days like that.
Well, that makes sense because just like any kind of deadline work, when you'd rather not do it or you're not sure how to do it, it falls toward the end. But frankly, you know, whenever my students are working up to 4 o'clock in the morning on something complex, it's probably not going to come out as well as they'd intended. And I'm with Representative Wagner. I don't know if any of the votes would be different if they'd happen at a different time. But you know, this is not the way to run any kind of business. And also on the budget side, you know, we're still waiting on the K-12 budget, which frankly might be the single most important thing that the state does because it's the biggest chunk of the state budget. And also the later we go for making decisions like this, the more you empower leadership in the Senate and the House and the governor's veto pen, and less you empower individual legislators, like, for example, Representative Wagner. And it makes it harder and harder for constituents to have real impact, especially considering, like, if you were in Topeka last night and you found out at 11 o'clock p.m. that something really interesting and important was happening in the State House, you wouldn't be able to get into it because it's closed. And so this isn't the way to run a democracy, but frankly, in America now, our democracy is teetering on the not collapse, but clearly in chaos in many different ways. And in Kansas, we're no worse than any place else.
Well, and I've got to say personally, as someone who has spent a lot of time following the State House, it's a lot easier now to follow it from a distance than it used to be with streaming and hashtag KSLedge on Twitter, to be honest. Yeah. I was watching quite a bit of that last night. Brandon, I know that some of your fellow Democrats, John Carmichael in particular, state representative comes to mind, have really tried to make some changes to some of this to prevent some of these late night sessions.
Yeah, and I agree. Those things should change when it's super late. If it's closed, people want to be there. I hear about that in local government. Some concerns about us not having evening meetings because people are at work during the day. I think having more access and transparency is always a good thing. I understand the difficulties in the State House, but some of that should be worked out, and I think it's of the utmost importance to do so.
So I want to look at some of the substantive items that came out of that late night session. As you consider some of those things that happened, what to you is the most important that Kansans should be paying the most attention to?
I don't know about important. I think it's utterly ridiculous to take someone's license for offering gender affirming care. As a doctor, you're supposed to help folks, not harm them, and because you help someone, now your license can be revoked. I think that's ridiculous. I think all the current attacks on transgender people are concerning and should be pushed back on. People are people, and when you see these attacks on the small percentage of people who are transgender, why are we wasting so much legislative time and taxpayer effort on that when we could be looking at expanding Medicaid, providing the services that people need, doing a hate crime bill, passing the Crown Act? I mean, there's so many more good things we could be doing rather than attack this percentage of our population.
Paul, I'm going to ask you the same question. As you look at the last 24 hours or so, what do you think is the most important legislation Kansans should really be paying attention to?
Well, one thing during this period is that everything is a strictly up and down vote. That you talked about the late hour. That is something to remember. There are no amendments. It's strictly up and down. As far as the concern, I mean, I think the gentleman's framing of the issue on the women's sports and whatever transgender issues, as people might call them, I think it's totally overplayed. I think that's something that you have to have a way to categorize where people compete, and there's a lot more I could say on that. But the tax bill was obviously a very big deal. The state of Kansas, we're running, our revenue is like $600 million already for the year over what it was anticipated to be. That this is taxpayer money and really needs to go back to them. I think it's a very good package. These number of these things are important. The ESG was sort of a start in that direction as to paying attention that our investments of the people, Republicans, Democrats, everybody, are not, straitjacketed into some ideological agenda, which is exactly what the ESG movement has been trying to do with funds for oil and gas companies, for just whatever tends to run afoul of their ideology. The Parents Bill of Rights, anything that accentuates and reinforces the fact that parents are the fundamental persons in charge are responsible for the education of their children, I think is a good pushback on what can be overreaching school districts, overreaching state interference.
All right, thanks, Paul. And I'm glad you say that you have a lot more to say on the transgender athletes bill, because that's what we're talking about next. On Wednesday, lawmakers overrode the governor's veto on that controversial bill, meaning that transgender athletes cannot participate in girls' and women's state-sponsored sports as of July 1st here in Kansas. The override votes left some lawmakers cheering through their news releases, but left others angry and in tears on the House floor. As passed into law, lawmakers have banned only transgender girls and women from participating in state-sponsored school sports. The ban does not apply to transgender boys and men. This is because supporters say those born male have a physical advantage over those born female, and that this is about ensuring fair competition. Hayes Representative Barbara Wassinger said not approving the ban would mean going back to a time before Title IX expanded women's opportunities in sports. Opponents say the Kansas High School Activities Association already has rules in place to make sure competition remains fair, and this new law just puts a target on the backs of a handful of kids. Feelings ran high during the debate on the veto override. After it was over in the House, Representative Susan Ruiz, herself LGBTQ, said she heard some Republicans laughing and yelled at them they were full of fecal matter. And Representative Heather Meyer, the mother of a transgender child, removed her jacket to unveil a Protect Trans Youth t-shirt. Meyer later tweeted, "Yes, we did, because we will fight for and support our trans kids no matter what." Reporters following the governor in Olathe that day say after hearing about the override, she told them, "It sort of breaks my heart, and certainly it is disappointing." Keisha says currently there are 11 students who are transitioning and registered in activities in Kansas. Not all are playing sports. That's out of more than 109,000 students registered. Currently, Keisha says there are 3 transgender girls competing in sports, and to date, it's had no complaints. By the time this bill becomes law on July 1st, 2 of those 3 will have graduated. So we are talking about a very small group of kids affected by this particular bill. One thing I found very interesting is obviously emotions extremely high during the debate, but amongst the public still very, very high on this topic. Marvin Robinson, a Kansas City Democrat who actually voted for the override, has gotten a lot of blowback because of it.
Yeah, he has. And, in the black community views, we're not all monolithic. And, a lot of us growing up have a strong faith background, and that lends to some of that. And there's others of us that see people as people. So I can't really blame that. I think more conversation needs to happen. But again, as you said, this is a small group of people. All this time and energy was spent to truly address, 11 students in the whole state. And we have so much more. I mean, the representative talked about having $600 million. Instead of doing a tax cut, we know we need mental health support. Instead of just one facility in Wichita, we've lost over 5,500 beds since the 90s. Why not make those investments? We always rush to cut taxes instead of making the investments in the things that we need, and then we can look at tax cuts later. But if the funds are there, we need to make those strategic investments for the betterment of people.
And Paul, I'm going to head out to you next. You said you had more to say on this. What are your thoughts as far as this override and whether it sticks around?
Well, again, this is our 3rd time to the bat for this. It's always had very strong support in the legislature. We've just been 1 or 2 votes short, and this time we had it together. You did have Republicans who voted against the women's sports bill lose their races in the 2022 election. And so part of what you're seeing is just the voice of the people. It is a small number of people, but it is a fundamental principle. I mean, there's no focus. I mean, this notion, to me, that's just, kind of left as smoke and mirrors. That the question is, when you have, equality of rights, as you do with any persons, and for instance, in the 60s with female in general, the question was always, so if everybody's equal, why not co-ed sports? Why not co-ed bathrooms? I mean, those things were particularly looked at and set aside, and biology was the clear indicator, and everybody understood the logic of it. And to somehow go against biology and go to this notion of gender identity, creates a whole can of worms. I think the legislature has totally done the right thing, that there's no way in Hades that the girls at Hutch High or Bueller High School not only are going to have a guy who now identifies as a woman, however sincere he may be, but to compete against them, to be in the locker rooms with them, which is a corollary of it, and which has happened on the NCAA basis. And so, there's as much as you want to be, kind and affirming of people, at the same point, you have to say certain things. You just that's a special case, and you're just not going to get what you want simply by proclaiming some identity.
And another issue that we look at with that, Neil, is as we're looking at the small numbers that are involved with this and the constantly changing science. I mean, I think it's like every other week I'm hearing new studies come out. This is an area of human psychology, human biology that we're still learning.
Well, that's true. And also when you think about the effect of this law, it's going to be very complicated because we have a case going forward in the federal system coming out of West Virginia that just yesterday led to a block of a very similar West Virginia bill. And so we might see litigation go all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court on this matter because there are competing rights claims here, as we've heard already tonight. There's a claim for women's rights, there's a claim for trans rights, there's a claim for universal rights in general. And also, the Biden administration just put out their Title IX guidance yesterday, And it would severely weaken the Kansas law that just passed, although it would allow for competition-based restrictions that might, the part about athletes in CASA and sports might survive that, but what probably wouldn't would be the restriction of people about gender identity from other things like intramural sports in schools or any kind of clubs. And that might be an interesting kind of compromise position that gets forced on us. But I don't think that we're going to see the end of this particular argument for quite a while.
I agree. We probably aren't going to see the end of this particular argument for quite a while, because there are certain segments of the Kansas population who say they're not going to let it go. Cake's Jackson Overstreet explains what they have in mind.
84 having voted in favor and 40 against the passage of House Bill 2238, the same having received a constitutional majority. The required 2/3 majority is hereby declared passed.
This was the moment Wednesday when the Kansas House overturned Governor Laura Kelly's veto of the trans athlete bill. That process was being watched closely here in Wichita.
There are very, very few transgender athletes in Kansas. To my knowledge, there have been no complaints from having transgender people in sports.
Jalen Abeg is the chair of the South Central Kansas chapter of Equality Kansas. She says the different transgender laws the state has either passed or are considering are going after problems that don't exist.
It's directly attacking our ability to live as the people that we are. It is seeking to box us into the gender we were born with.
Abeg is not the only one objecting to the series of bills.
Legislation like this hurts people. It is going to cost us jobs, and it's going to lead to lower economic growth for all Kansans.
Chris Pompelli is the founder of Proud of Wichita, the city's LGBTQ Chamber of Commerce. He's afraid that bills like this coming out of Topeka are going to discourage people and businesses from moving to the state.
I talk to members of the chamber nearly every day who talk to me about problems they have recruiting. They're having to tell stories about how it's really not as bad as you're hearing in national news.
And on the opposite side of that argument, I spoke with a lot of economic developers who are saying that, we're not seeing the big businesses do boycotts like we did a few years ago with the NCAA and such, because so many states have now moved to this sort of legislation that it's just not feasible anymore.
Well, also, this bill is different in terms of its impact from what are often called bathroom bills, because here we're talking about a defined activity in society, meaning high school sports and activities, and also one where, for the most part, these are voluntary things. And the NCAA action about boycotting of Indiana on a religious freedom bill that involved this, and there's action in North Carolina a few years ago as well. All of that is frankly, a much larger issue than what we're talking about here. Although I will say it is a positive thing about our society that we have gone in 50 years from social conservatives opposing Title IX and defending the idea of men's sports and women in non-sports activities in school, to the point where now we're actually talking about how to best promote women as equal participants in athletics. And so American society and politics does make progress, however slowly.
And Paul, as we look at this issue, one thing that I have to wonder is, this is right now it affects one, maybe two or three students in Kansas. Meanwhile, we know that other states that have passed basically the same legislation are embroiled in these long-lasting lawsuits that cost hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars. Why rush so quickly? Why not wait until we see how those lawsuits work out?
As I said earlier, Pilar, it's really a question of just the principle of the thing. Everybody can compete. Everybody has a place. There's no ban on any athlete at all. That's a terrible rendition of the bill. It's just what is the best category for people. And in sports competitions, it's clearly by biology. And I tell you, you have these cases, you have plenty of cases, and it's a growing amount of cases because this gender ideology, or the notion of just gender being so whatever you make of it and that it's determinative is still, 10 years ago as far as its popularity, and there's no boundary lines with it. So, it's an issue. It hasn't hit Kansas so much directly, but again, we're standing on the principle of it, and it just, let's move past this. I'm really shocked that the whole LGBT activist people think that this is the hill to die on, when it clearly, if it's 2 or 3 people, I mean, it's the principle of it, that clearly we're in the right, that biology, and again, you look at the records, you can have high school boys, and I have looked at these numbers, high school AAU boys versus Olympic level women, and the 16-year-old boys will beat the Olympic level women. I mean, just the notion that there's that this is just a minimal difference on the higher level, it is not a minimal difference at all. And you literally, if you had all sports being effectively co-ed, you would rarely see a female athlete standing on the top stage. And that's why you have women's sports separate from men. It's 2 different categories. And there's no shame in that at all. It's just a very logical, it's a biology-based thing. It's not a theology-based principle per se at all. And I'm just stunned at the inability of the people on the left to get the memo and move on from this.
And Brandon, I can tell you had something you wanted to say.
So it's that type of thinking that really triggers folks and triggers them in a way that their being is being attacked. And we can say it's a small group. It is. It's 11 athletes. We talk about 3 playing. The entire community, the LGBTQIA plus community, sees that and knows that today it's them, tomorrow it could be another group. As a black person, I see today it's our trans folk. It could be somebody else in the LGBTQ community. We're not far removed from the black community being discriminated against. It's that, and then the notion of just get over it, just move on. We're always told that. Minority groups who are discriminated against are always told, get over it, move on. It's not that big a deal, but we see folks being under attack, and that's the issue. We always want the emotionless response to some policy discussion, but when the policy truly addresses your being, what else do you have? Because if you make that argument that I'm making now without emotion, then it could be heard, but it'd be dismissed. And we see that in the legislature. But it's your being, it's your life, it's your family. And that's what people are feeling right now. That's why you see the high emotion on the folks who feel like they're being attacked, because they are.
And also, I would like to respectfully disagree with Representative Wagner about a couple things he said. One, saying that this is a new phenomenon just over the last decade, and also that it's an ideology. That people are making the argument that gender is a completely fluid concept. But just to think about my personal experience, I grew up in a place very similar to Wichita or parts of Kansas, and I grew up in suburban/rural Indiana as a son of farmers. And I happen to be identified male, and that identity fits me. But if I had any kind of gender identity crisis growing up in the 1980s, there's no way that I would have been honest with anybody about that. Because, I mean, just being bullied was bad enough for boys that did not have the kind of masculine presentation that former football players like my friend Brandon Johnson did. and so you don't know that. And so, like, for my friends who have transitioned or who have identity that maybe isn't what their birth certificate had, it's not their ideology, it's their identity. And we are just now at a point in our society where we can face up to the fact that not all of us fit in 2 boxes. And Councilman Johnson is right that that there's no rights denial that is irrelevant.
And Paul, I'm sure you have something else you want to say, but we do need to move on. One last thing we're going to get to today. The entire transgender bill isn't the only one lawmakers have passed facing a veto this year and probable override attempt. Several other pieces of legislation headed the governor's way now are highly unpopular, especially with Democrats. According to the Kansas Reflector, Governor Kelly has to decide whether or not to veto several bills passed by the Republican-dominated legislature. Those bills limit rights of the state's transgender or non-binary residents and affirm the obligation of physicians to provide medical care to infants born alive during an abortion. The anti-abortion measure cleared the House and Senate with veto-proof majorities. The Reflector says the bill forbidding transgender individuals from using public facilities and changing names or gender on driver's licenses to align with their gender identity had sufficient support for veto override in the Senate, but fell 1 vote shy in the House. Kelly has been an advocate of abortion rights and repeatedly denounced legislation aimed at disenfranchising LGBTQ Kansans. She has three choices: veto the bills, sign them into law, or allow either to become state law without her signature. And Paul, I'm going to start with you on this one. Several bills passed, some of them more controversial than others. What ones do you see as most likely to face a veto and a veto override attempt?
You know, the abortion reversal bill we had approved before a few years ago, but it had lost. The Board of Life bill, which back in the 2000s on the federal level, 80% of all Democrat legislators supported it. And now you have in Topeka, 80% of the Democrats are against it, which is a total flip. But again, I think those two. I think I have no concern that we can't override on those. I mean, the tricks are going to be on, like the ESG bill or the Parents' Bill of Rights. You'll have certain bills that maybe it's some Western Kansas Republicans or some people with just a little, just the boundaries as to what makes sense are not so clear. But the GOP, every new legislature, you wonder how the new freshmen are going to perform. What's going to be their real, voting philosophy. And I think we found out that you have a very solid group of freshmen here in 2023, certainly on the Republican side of it, with one or two Democrats that are frankly able to break ranks and are willing to. And so I think we're in pretty good shape as far as the caucus is. The one question also had just been, is Laura Kelly, in her first term, she had a reason to be amenable and work with us. Now that she's not up for re-election again, she could just go veto crazy and just start, zapping everything and forcing us back to the table and by not approving it.
And you kind of stole my next thought right from me, Paul. It seems like the GOP legislature is pushing a little bit harder against Laura Kelly this year. And she was very upfront that she may be out of time, or because she does have to run for re-election.
Well, right, and the really big issue for the state and its future is the flat tax. And while this is not Brownback tax cut, it's kind of Brownback light. At least we're not exempting people from whole parts of taxation, but it's going to blow a big old hole in the state budget, and that's why I think she's going to veto.
All right. Well, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks again, Neil, Brandon, and Paul, for joining us today. We'd also like to thank our news partners at the Wichita Eagle, KSN News, and Cake News for sharing their materials with us. For now, stay safe and have a great week.